Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Bikes or Death podcast. My name is Patrick, and I'm your host. I'd like to remind you that this show is 100% listener supported. As we go into a new year, like many of you, I am making goals, and I have 3 goals for this podcast. Number 1, I'm going to try like hell to produce 50 shows this year. So that's basically one a week. I'm going to give myself a few sick days. But basically, I'm going to try to put out one a week. Number 2, I really want to get the van mobile podcasting studio up and running. I want to get it out there in the field and interviewing great guests. And number 3, I want to focus on continuing the listener supported aspect of this show. If you've been following along, you'll know that I have been pushing to keep this show free from advertising. And I thought I'd just explain why. In this day and age, we are just inundated in every direction by consumerism, by someone telling you, what you should buy, where you should live, what kind of car you should drive, what kind of clothes you should wear, yada, yada, yada. I mean, the Facebook algorithms and everything else that's just designed to basically sell you something. How long can we keep your attention? I want to keep your attention too, but I want to do it because of great content, and I want ideally the listener to value the content that's here and appreciate it enough to show your support. So those are 3 really big goals this year, and obviously none of them can happen without your support. If you can appreciate the value of the show and the efforts that I'm making to produce a quality show with amazing guests and bring you into the lives of some of these people that we hear about or watch videos or watch their dots, and even some people that you may not be familiar of. I like to hear stories from all walks of life and all levels of interest and capabilities in the sport. It's been an amazing ride so far. I've been very grateful for the support that I have received, and so thank you. It's not that I'm ungrateful. It's just that I got plans and I want to grow this thing, and I can't do it without you. So if you will take a moment either right now or after the show, head over to bikesfordeath.com and you can sign up as a Patreon, which is a sustaining member of the show. You can also give a one-time donation on PayPal. You can also find out about the GoFundMe that's set up right now to finance the mobile podcasting studio. And there is a raffle to go along with that. And we're giving away prizes at every $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000. We're already at like $2,035, I think. And so I've already given away some great prizes. I appreciate everybody that's donated to that so far. And lastly, of course, you can always just buy some merchandise. I've got some new shirts on the way. Those will be in stock here in about a week or 2. And you can just rep the show and make everybody else jealous. So it doesn't matter how, but please go over to bikesfordeath.com, find a way to support the show, and let's keep this show going and growing strong into the new year. And as always, don't forget to head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review. That's how other people find it, and that makes me happy. All right, well, today's guest is a special one. I think I say that every week. It's Roger Gilles. He is an author of the book Women on the Move. I've referred to this book a few times in previous episodes. One of my personal relatives is featured in the book. Her name is Dottie Farnsworth, which is the reason I picked it up initially. But as I read it, it became so much more than just her story. It really opened up my eyes to how amazing our sport is, how long it's been around, how integral to our society it has been, both for men and for women. But this book focuses on the women primarily, and it tells a story that I think very few actually know. He refers to it as the forgotten era of cycling, and I think he's exactly right. As a lifelong cyclist, I'd never heard any of these stories. I didn't even know I was related to one of them. So I'm very grateful that he put a book together with some valuable information so that we can all have that. And I'm glad that he was just willing to sit down and talk to me. It was such an honor. All right. Well, I think that's it. So what do you say we get to the show?
You load up your bike, you ride away from home. You could be with your friends or you could be alone. You ride for a day or maybe more. You just love being in the great outdoors. Everything you need shooting that new pillow you got from Santa Claus. And then you think, oh shit, to yourself. You left that super lightweight tent on the living room shelf. Bikes. Oh, death. Bikes. Oh, death. Podcast.
All right. Well, tonight I am joined by a special guest, one that I've been looking forward to a long time, author Roger Gilles. He is the author of Women on the Move. And I found out about this book when I was watching a documentary called Bicycle that I believe was released in 2014. And I was watching that show and they mentioned Dottie Farnsworth. And I happen to be Patrick Farnsworth. And so I really cued in on that. And so I started, obviously researching her and turns out I did the research. Actually, my mom did the research. Dottie is my sixth cousin, 3 times removed. As far as I was concerned, that was good enough to get her tattooed on my leg. So I got a Dottie tattoo on my leg now. I'll have to send you a picture of that. But yeah, and so it was God, a week or two after I saw that documentary where your book came out, Women on the Move. So if you could, real quick, let's go back. I'd like to hear about your personal history in cycling before we get into the book.
Okay, well, I have to say that there's not much there. I was just a casual cyclist. I've never had a particular interest in cycling other than recreational cycling around the house and riding around town. And all of this material really just fell into our lap. I say our because it was really my wife who discovered the material first.
Okay.
And then I took it over a few years after that. But all of my knowledge of and interest in cycling is wrapped up in researching and writing this book.
Right. So what was it about this story that really grabbed your attention and made you want to actually tell it?
Well, let me start by talking about how my wife got into it.
Yeah, please.
We live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and about 12 or 15 years ago, my wife was in the women's room of a pizza cafe here in town, and she saw on the wall of the restroom an old postcard, and the postcard was from the early 20th century, and it was hearkening back to a time when Tilly the Terrible Swede, it said, had visited Grand Rapids in 1897, and was giving a bicycling exhibition. And it said that in the postcard, it said that Tilly Anderson, actually it said Tilly the Terrible Swede only, was the fastest bicyclist of her sex. Well, it turns out that my wife is a children's book author, and she likes to focus her picture books on strong women in history. So she thought, who is this Tilly the Terrible Swede? And so she looked into her. This was about 2007 or 2008. She looked into Tilly and found out that she was Tilly Anderson and that she was a famous bicycle racer back in the 1890s.
Right.
And she didn't know anything about her. At that time, very little had been written about Tilly. Well, fast forward 3 years, my wife published a children's book with Random House, or a Knot for Children, about Tilly. And in the process of publishing that book, Sue, my wife, got in touch with a woman named Alice Repke in Kansas, who was Tilly Anderson's grandniece. And she had been trying to get Tilly's story out into the public for decades, really, and had mixed success about that. And so Alice found out that Sue was writing this book and was very excited about it and ended up sharing a lot of information with Sue that helped the book. But it was a children's book, so there wasn't a whole lot there in terms of content. So there was all this content, just kind of sitting there. And when we met Alice finally, and I saw that she had 4 volumes of scrapbooks. She had a trunk load of photographs and memorabilia and letters. She had her Tilly's old bicycle. She had the old racing outfit. And I'm a writing professor. No interest particularly in cycling, but I'm interested in writing and I'm interested in stories. And I thought somebody has to write this book. Yeah. And I just volunteered. And so that's how I.
That's interesting. So just out of curiosity, how does that work? Does Allison own that story or she was just integral to getting some of the information that you needed to be able to write the book?
Well, I mean, there's no way this book could have been written without Alice's material. I mean, there's a lot of material in archival newspaper articles for sure.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of research. But there are hundreds and hundreds of articles that she had in her scrapbooks that are no longer available in any archive, either in microfilm or in digital format. So there's just no way this book could have been written. Plus, Alice had all these great photographs that I think really make the book a lot better. And there are actually a lot more that we could put in there.
Yeah. Now the photographs go a long way to really tell the story of what America looked like and what conditions were like, and just it really paints the whole picture for you.
I think what comes across in those photos is that it was both a very long time ago and it wasn't that long ago. You know,
Yes.
We're talking about the 1890s. Anyway, I made the decision early on, whatever contract we signed with the book, Alice and I would just be 50-50, not co-authors because I wrote the book,
Right.
but she is an equal contributor. So we've been sharing all of sharing the royalties or whatever we get from the book are equal to us. Yeah.
Well, it's a great story, so I'm glad that she was able to retain that stuff and get it in somebody's hands that could tell that story. And the story was well told. I have to ask, I'm curious, how did you approach it? Not being necessarily a hardcore cyclist per se, or having a lot of background historicity on cycling. How did you approach it as an author?
Well, I think I was lucky, actually, not being a serious cyclist, because I think I understood that a casual reader, and I do think that I was aiming for a casual reader, someone who's interested in history, women's history, sports history, bicycling history, or just bicycling. There's just so much background information that's needed to understand what was unique about that racing. And my struggle as a writer was not to start the book with 100 pages of background before we started on some kind of story.
That's a good point.
And I struggled with it. I had 3 or 4 different versions of the structure of the book, trying to figure out, how do I start this that's both a narrative beginning and a way allows me to tell the development, for example, from the old high wheel bicycle to what they call the safety bicycle, which is the modern day bicycle.
Right.
These women in the 1890s raced on the safety bicycle, and it's very much like the bicycles people ride on today. But most people, when they think 19th century bicycling, they see that old penny farthing or the high wheel bicycle. And so just to understand the revolution that occurred in the early 1890s when they went to the pneumatic tire and the chain-driven gearing, that allowed bicycles to go so much faster, and also allowed races to go so much longer because the tires were so much better. And so to explain all that in a succinct way while still telling the story was the big challenge. And actually what I ended up doing was telling the story of how my wife saw that postcard and how I into material. And then I started with the very first race of Tilly Anderson's career. And so I really make her the vehicle, I guess, for telling the story of those women.
Yeah. Well, she was a pretty, I mean, especially from your telling, a central figure to, well, not even from your telling, but all the newspaper articles and all the races she won, and quite entertaining for sure. So why don't you set the stage for us, if you will? What did women's bike racing look like in the very beginning when it was just getting started? What was the climate like socially, and just set a stage for us of what that looked like?
Well, let me go back for a moment to the
Sure.
1880s when women were racing on those high wheels. The high wheel bicycle was not a fast bicycle. It was essentially a novelty machine because it was an awkward ride. People could go, 15, 16, 17 miles an hour on it at top speed. Over any amount of time, they would average 11 or 12 miles an hour. And the reason that women raced essentially was so that audiences could see women on such a machine. It was just the novelty of seeing a woman climb on such a machine and ride around and be athletic.
Yeah.
There were no women's athletics before the 1880s. I mean, it just didn't exist. So these 1880s women were really the first women to be athletic in front of an audience, but they were still viewed primarily as a kind of a circus act. And I mean, some people would argue with that a little bit, but it really was a novelty. And the show was watching women race.
Right.
Whereas in the 1890s, when the safety bicycle came in, now the bicycle was fast. They could ride 25, 26, 27 miles an hour at top speed, and they got as fast as 30 and 32 miles an hour sometimes. And they could average 20, 22 miles an hour over a 2 or 3 hour time period. So they could really ride fast. So now it was watching women race as opposed to watching women ride. And so it made the sport quite different. But probably the most important thing to understand about the sport as I reported it is that this was an arena sport. So this was not an outdoor field sport where they would do road racing. And these women did do road racing too. But for the most part, it was an arena sport where they would get together and stage a race in an arena, build a wooden track. It was banked all the way around. It was usually 16, 17 laps per mile. So it wasn't much bigger, very much like the kind of track you see at a YMCA that people run around on. Mm-hmm. Not a very big track. And so with that banked track and with 5 or 6 women riding around at 20 miles an hour, it was very much, I call it roller derby on bikes. They were jostling with each other. They were pushing each other. They would crash all the time. But it was neck and neck racing. And so they were racing around these tracks. The crowds were going nuts. They were seeing women not only being athletic, but also being extremely competitive with one another. And like I said, pushing each other and crashing. Yeah. And then at the end of 2 or 3 hours, the race would often come down to what we would call now a photo finish. They didn't have cameras then, but they had cameras, but they didn't have camera finishes, but they would have a neck finish. And they would argue about who won, and they would argue about who elbowed whom. And so it was quite an entertainment.
Yeah. How much, I mean, I don't know if we know this, but how much of their motivation to go out there and race fast and be so aggressive was spurred on by, expectations of women at that time? I mean, I assume, had to have a huge chip on their shoulder just wanting to go out there and prove all the naysayers wrong.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. First of all, I should point out that most of the women, and Dottie, your relative, might be an exception on this, but most of the women were working class women. And so their primary interest was in making money. And they got paid well to do these races. A typical first prize purse for a week-long race, they would race 2 or 3 hours a night over 6 days. A typical winner's purse was $200 or $250, and the second place person would get $150. And this was at a time when a working class family might make $600 or $800 a year. So they were making $200 in a week. And they would race 15, 20 times in a year. So they were making thousands of dollars a year compared to the hundreds of dollars a year they were making as seamstresses or laundry workers or restaurant workers. So they were driven by that money, but they were also, of course, athletes. And this is what makes it so interesting, is that I think they were torn in a way, or maybe equally motivated by the fact that they were experiencing something that was not available to women before them, which is to be competitive athletes. But they also very much wanted to make the money. They didn't care much about the larger social situation. I don't think they consider themselves feminists. I don't have any evidence that they were interested in the women's movement or anything like that. But they became symbols of that women's movement because they were getting out in front of people, making a living. They were challenging the social mores that said that the male was the one who earned the living and the women did not. These women, if they had husbands, their husbands were in the support role. Yeah. Helping them make the living for that family.
They were the manager, the mechanic, the starter, the everything, right?
That's right. Now, there was definitely there were a lot of sexual politics going on, because there was not just women's racing, of course, but there was also men's racing. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of social interactions going on around the women who were primarily interested in racing and making money.
Yeah, I know you do mention that Tilly was very vocal about just being there for the money. And there was one race where they announced, I think like during the race or something, that there wasn't going to be a purse. And she just stopped riding and went out into the stands and just took her seat. Said, okay, not getting paid. I'm not going to race.
Yeah, actually, I hate to correct you there, Patrick, but that was actually Lizzie, who was another one of the racers.
Lizzie Glaw. Lizzie Glaw.
Lindsay Glaw was she was the epitome of the racing, the person that was in it for the money. And she was the one who, if the money wasn't there, she was not interested in racing. Now, Tilly, I think, was an example of somebody who really wanted to be, and she's ahead of her time in this way. I think she really wanted to be a first-rate athlete, and she very much wanted to be remembered as a great athlete. And I think that's one of the reasons why Alice wanted to keep her memory alive, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make Tilly a feature of the book, because it was so important to Tilly to be remembered as a great woman athlete. And as you know, I try to make the case in the book that these were the first great American women athletes.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to argue with that, really.
I mean, what they were accomplishing, especially with all the adversity, is pretty incredible. I want to circle back to, well, why don't you, if you will, talk about the way that the tracks were built, especially in the very beginning. I think I recall in your book, you talking about, them finding like scrap wood almost around and then throwing these tracks together, and then they would come and race on them. So you're not talking about a perfectly polished track. There's nails, there's, maybe you could like talk about what that was like, because what I'm so fascinated by, and I think people will be really interested, cyclists will be really interested in, is the endurance side, the speeds that they were maintaining, the days that they were going, the miles, and they were doing it on these tracks.
So the context here is that men had what was called 6-day races, and the 6-day races took place on well-built tracks, often permanent tracks. And they would race basically 24 hours a day, starting Monday at midnight, Sunday into Monday at midnight, and then go all the way till Saturday night. And over the course of that 6-day race, audiences would come and go, but the men would keep on circling the track. They would eat on the bike. They would sometimes sleep in the infield and then race some more. And so when the women started racing, they took on that 6-day format, but they shortened the races to only 2 or 3 hours a day. Throughout all of the beginning of the development of the women's racing, there was a constant kind of tension between seeing the women as, again, a novelty, seeing it as an entertainment or as a circus act almost, not taking it very seriously, and the women primarily and their managers taking it seriously and thinking of it as a sport. So on the not serious side, the people who built the tracks thought there's no reason for them to race on a permanent track. They're only women. Or let's just build a slipshod track because they're only women and they're not trying that hard. So it doesn't matter if it's in great shape. So the tracks ended up, as you say, often being thrown together, usually just for the week they raced. And then at the end of the week, it would get torn down and sold for scrap. And so often there were imperfections on the track. Sometimes they were banked too much. Sometimes they weren't banked enough. Sometimes the women were limited at what speed they could go, because if they rode faster than 25 miles an hour, they would go right off the edge. So they were up by the quality of the track. Sometimes they were 14 laps to a mile. Sometimes they were 22 laps to a mile. So sometimes they were tiny tracks. So there was this constant kind of battle to legitimize the sport by taking the tracks seriously. But the irony of it is that those small tracks and the steeply banked tracks, they were much smaller than the men's, because they had to fit into smaller arenas, because again, they weren't sure if the women would draw the big crowds, so they went to smaller arenas, sometimes theaters or auditoriums, so they squeezed the track in there. Because of that, they were able to get that whipsaw effect of racing on a steeply banked track,
Mm.
And they ended up riding faster than the men because they learned how to ride on those bikes. They adjusted the bicycles, of course, for it too. They raised the pedals up so it wouldn't hit the side of the track on the bank. They shortened up the bicycles so that they would be more nimble on those small tracks. And so they basically became unique athletes in that they were the only ones in the world that could ride on those bicycles because they got trained on those kinds of bicycles. So it was just a really interesting kind of conflagration of circumstances that created this sport, which by 1897 or 1898 began to settle into expertise. And now they were building more serious tracks. They started to go much faster even. And they were more serious about timing it. And they were more serious about, for example, early on, they would often bring in local racers that weren't very good because they thought, well, we'll draw in more people if we have a local person. And so sometimes they would have 3 or 4 racers who were quite good and race other times. And then 2 people who had never raced on a track before. And they would slow things down, of course, and they would get in the way and sometimes cause accidents. By 1897 or 1898, that was 1895 or 1896. By 1897 or 1898, they would no longer do that. They would just have the professionals on the track. And so they became much better.
Yeah. I want to real quick go back because you mentioned the men's racing. And I think if I understand or remember correctly, the contrast between the men's racing and the women's racing helped to popularize the women's racing even more so than the men's. Am I remembering that correctly?
You are, yeah. Again, it's ironic, but in the 1880s with those high wheels, really the only interesting kind of race with a high wheel bicycle is an endurance race because it was not a sprinting machine. It wouldn't work to have sprints. I mean, they had them actually, but for the most part, the big races were these 6-day races where they raced around the clock. And because of a lack of imagination or whatever, when they moved over to the safety bicycle or the regular modern bicycle, they continued with those endurance races. That was what bicycle racing was. They would race 6 days a week and do an endurance race. And when these male managers and race promoters and track builders started to promote women's racing, they just assumed, okay, the women are not as strong, they are not as athletic, so we'll shorten the race to 2 or 3 hours a day. For no other reason than they thought that's what the women could handle. And because they had to squeeze into these smaller arenas, they made the banks steeper. The men's banks were only like 15 or 20 degrees bank. Yeah. Because there were larger tracks. And so by shortening the races, they allowed the women to basically sprint for 2 hours or for 3 hours in the night, whereas the men were pacing themselves. And by banking the tracks, they allowed the women to race in tightly packed bunches, which was very exciting. Whereas the men, as I say in the book, the men's races, sometimes a man would win by 65 miles over the course of a week. It wasn't much of a finish. You knew who was going to win by Wednesday of a 6-day race.
It was just a war of attrition.
It was just a war of attrition. And whereas with the women, they were neck and neck every night, and you never know who was going to win. And it basically came down to who was going to crash or be unable to get up after their crash. And so it became a much better sport. So what happened, probably the most surprising thing early on in my research was realizing that these women were drawing thousands of people per night. And there's a Chicago finale race where they drew 12,000 people in an arena in Chicago. So it's a huge number of people that were very interested in these races and paying money in order to watch women compete in sports.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, especially if you think about where women were at. And I think we should talk about the Victorian Society. Is that what it's called? The Victorian Society that was putting out publications in the paper about, these snarling women and how there's no way that they can participate without becoming grotesque. And you can talk to it better than I can, but that was going on at this time period, right?
Yeah. So in the kind of common imagination, any athletic activity was dangerous to women. I mean, this was a time when that physical education was a radical concept. They were just beginning to ask girls in school to play tennis, on lawn tennis, or croquet even, and to do a little bit of track and field. They were doing a very early and very lame version of basketball. Just not much was happening. Hey, swimming, skating, things like that. But just the idea of physical education was questionable. To sit on a bicycle and exert yourself for 2 hours was considered almost suicidal. I mean, they really thought that these women were probably never going to be able to bear children. They would probably shorten their lives. Mm-hmm. Certainly, they would coarsen themselves and make themselves unattractive by becoming muscular and athletic. Again, these are working class women, so I think they thought, whatever. It's kind of like we marvel sometimes at our NFL players who might be threatening their long-term brain health by playing this sport, but they're making millions of dollars, and at some level, they're making this calculation. It's worth it. I'm 25 years old and I'm rich and I'm famous, and so I might suffer when I'm in my 50s, but I will take that when it comes. They felt that they might be endangering their lives by doing this racing, but it was worth it. Now, as we know now, it turns out no, they were not endangering their lives. They were making themselves healthier, so they had the last laugh. But during that time, it was in the interest of the elite culture, if you will, to make sure that these women did not become role models for the average woman. So there were articles that would show, usually, again, ironically, through etchings as opposed to photographs, because they didn't really publish many photographs in the newspapers back then. So they would have an etching, an artist rendition of a woman's face who had been racing, and show how ugly it was. And so they would sometimes pair, here she was before the race, Dottie Farnsworth before the race, and Dottie was very pretty. And then after the race, and the artist would basically just make her ugly. And that was the evidence that they gave that racing was ruining these women. But they also, these were pioneer women who started to appreciate the fact that they had muscles and that they felt strong. And it would make the journalists recoil sometimes to learn that these women were not ashamed of the fact that they had muscles and that they actually felt good about it. And they would train by wrestling and boxing and lifting weights. They would train by doing 25-mile rides in town every day so they could get in shape for their races. And so they became, pioneer athletes in a way that, matches what people do today.
Yeah, they were legit athletes. I mean, traveling around. I mean, there was a lot of fanfare going on around the sport. I do want to say though, because what you were talking about with the artist renderings in the papers, one of my favorite stories is, I think it was Tilly, had 5 guys in a room, and she showed them her leg, and there was a doctor there and a couple journalists. That is one of my favorite stories from the whole thing, because it really does just really show where we were at as a society. So maybe if you could tell that in your own words, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So, like the subtitle of the book is the forgotten era of women's bicycle racing. And it's true that this era has been forgotten for the most part through the 20th century and into the 21st. But one story that kind of lingered into the 20th century was that leg article story, because that was published in a St. Louis paper, which is a big city, certainly back then. It's a big city. And it's so interesting and shocking in a way, but basically what they did was they went to her hotel room, as you say, and wanted to examine a woman's muscular leg and see what has happened to her body as the result of a couple of years of professional bicycle racing. And, essentially the doctor found that anatomically speaking, scientifically speaking, her leg was in terrific shape. It was well-formed, muscular, visible veins where you could see that the blood flowed well in the leg, and well-formed and kind of beautiful.
Yeah.
But beautiful in the sense of a science textbook. Whereas in the kind of style of the day, aesthetically, it was an ugly leg. And that a beautiful leg, a woman's leg back then, was one that was smooth, no musculature, no hardening to it. And so the point of the article basically was to show how grotesque a leg would become. But it caused such a sensation back then that it was reprinted all over the country. Women were talking about it all over. It was shocking enough just to have a drawing of a woman's naked leg, because this was a time in Victorian society when women wore skirts that went down to the ground. And it was actually a whole nother level of shocking that these races occurred with women racing in tights. Yeah. So they would show their bodies in the races too. And I'm sure many of the men and women went to the races in part to see these women in these outfits.
Oh, so yeah.
Just
there was one news article I remember where they were talking about between the shorts that one of the ladies was wearing and her tights, it had separated about an inch, and the guys in the audience were just hooting and hollering and carrying on because they could see a little bit of skin.
That's right. Well, the women were not allowed to wear. They had to wear sleeves that went all the way down to their wrists because they couldn't show their arm skin. So it was a very conservative society when it came to showing women's bodies. The women, to their credit, refused to wear the baggy pantaloons of the 1880s, but wanted to wear sleek outfits. So they did wear the basically woolen jerseys and woolen bicycle shorts with tights underneath it. So you could definitely tell that they were women by the shape of their body, but the skin was not allowed to be shown. So when they would fall and tear the hose, and they wanted to keep racing, and so that you could see the skin, it was all the better for the audience, and the men did hoot and holler about
it. How often were they wrecking? I mean, I know that. I mean, flats. I mean, how do you have any sense for how frequently, how tough? I mean, other than the physical and the endurance side, which is really impressive, just how tough these ladies really were. There were so many stories about, they'd fall down and within like 2 laps, they were back up and they were going again, and, that kind of stuff. How often were they falling?
Well, I think it was unusual really for a woman to go through a 2 or 3 hour heat without falling. They pretty much fell every night. And it was, yeah. And, sometimes they were relatively easy falls and sometimes they were hard falls. But you mentioned the 2 or 3 lap allowance. Again, with the 6-day races of the men's, if somebody was going to win by 65 miles by the end of the week, people dropped out. It wasn't a big deal. And in fact, people dropped out on purpose. They took a break. So when women's racing first began, even with the shortened format, it never occurred to the race promoters to have an allowance for falls. And then they realized if a woman fell and was the only one who fell and everyone else lapped her, she would lose the race because the women's races were so close. So they instituted this rule where generally it was 30 to 60 seconds they had to recover, either get a new bicycle if they had a flat tire, or get a new bicycle if they wrecked the bicycle, or just get back on the bicycle. And if they did that within a lap or two, it would not be counted against them. So part of the entertainment then was to see if a woman who fell obviously hurt herself. You could see her scrape against the board. Sometimes they would get bloody elbows, or you could see a strawberry on their thigh or whatever. Sometimes they would sprain their wrists or even break bones. To see if she could get up within 40 seconds or 30 seconds and get back on her bicycle. And once they got back on their bicycle, sometimes you could see that they were recovering, kind of wobbly for a little while because they were trying to get back into the swing of things. But the easy falls were the ones where a woman would slip because she was trying to go too fast or trying to cut too fast and just slide and fall on the boards. The hard ones was when 2 or 3 women got tangled up and all went down together. And they would sometimes get hurt by the other person's pedals or their handlebars or something like that. And so sometimes there were severe injuries, broken collarbones or lacerations. Sometimes the reporters described the lacerations as being, 3 inches long and a half inch deep. So they would definitely get hurt. And as you know, ultimately, your relative Dottie Farnsworth died from internal bleeding that turned into blood poisoning as a result of falling on a bicycle.
Yeah. I'm curious actually to get, since you brought that up, your perspective on that, because how did her dying impact any of the progress that was made by women? Because as we've talked about, not only are they showing that women are physical, they are strong, but these society ideas of what a woman can and cannot do are just being broken down all the way to the clothes that they can wear. I mean, so how did her death impact that progress, if any?
So when my wife Sue wrote her book, and when I first started to do the research into my book, the story that we received was that women's bicycle racing started in 1895. This new era, the safety era of women's bicycle racing, started in 1895, and then ended in 1902 when Dottie Farnsworth died as a result of injuries in a race, and that Dottie's death was the reason for banning women's racing. It's a good story, and I believed it, but in my research, I realized that really wasn't the way it happened. There are lots of reasons why women's racing died out in 1902. And in some ways, men's racing died out as well, although men's racing recovered fairly quickly in the 19-teens and 20s. But Dottie had already left the sport, partly because she had gotten married and wanted to be closer to her home in Minneapolis. And partly because she was getting older. She was 27 or 28 by then. And so she was actually racing with a circus and doing an exhibition kind of racing where they were racing on a very tiny track. They called it a cycle whirl or loop-to-loop kind of thing, where they would just ride around in a very small track, almost 90-degree angle, But she did fall on the bicycle and did get an injury. But that was pretty much at the exact same time in June of 1902 when the very last women's races were occurring. And there may have been a connection made in the newspapers, but there was not a causal connection there. But for whatever reason, it did get reported. I found a 1941 article, for example, in Chicago that said women's racing was finally banned because of the death of a racer. So that got into the popular imagination somehow, but I couldn't really find evidence for that.
Yeah. Well, I was interested to hear that because when I watched that documentary Bicycle, that was the story that they told was Dottie's death was kind of like the nail in the coffin to women's racing. But when I read your book, there was a lot of other things going on at the time, probably the automobile being one of the largest, and then some of the politics and racing got in the way, and there was less interest because they thought that it was all kind of set up and they were just putting on a show and they weren't really going after it, so to speak. So yeah, I was curious because I've heard. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say what one thing did get banned, and that was 24-hour racing. 6-day races were banned, but they were the men's races, right. And part of the reason they were banned is because the men, in order to compete 24 hours a day for 6 straight days, were doing all manner of drugs and, abusing themselves in all sorts of ways in order to finish the races. And it was such a spectacle. It was a ghoulish kind of display of human endurance that it was, a commentator said it's worse than boxing. And at that time, boxing was bare-fisted boxing. And said it's worse than watching a boxing match because these men are just killing themselves by racing. So in 1898 or 1899, some state legislatures started to ban 6-day racing. So they said you cannot race any more than 12 hours a day. That was the law. So, because it's abusive to race more than 12 hours a day. So I think that the banning of men's 24-hour 6-day races and then the demise of women's racing kind of got conflated. So the banning of 6-day races, women were racing 6 days too, but they were racing 2 or 3 hours a day. That got conflated together. But, you know, in the automobile for sure. So bicycling itself became far less popular by 1900. Mm-hmm. It was the biggest thing around in 1894, 1895, because it was the fastest way to travel. Trains in a city would, you know, they would go slow. The intercontinental, or I should say, the continental trains would go 30 or 35 miles an hour. So they were fast, but it was in the middle of the country. So in a city, there's no way you could go faster than riding a bicycle. So it was a great form of transportation. And of course, by 1898, 1899, 1900, they not only motorized bicycles and made motorcycles out of them, but also started to introduce the car. So the bicycle boom of the 1890s just started to fade away. It was no longer as interesting to watch people ride a bicycle when everybody became used to riding bicycles. You know, they became normal. So it was no longer any kind of novelty. And so it had to survive purely as a sport as opposed to as a spectacle or as an entertainment. And I think that contributed to the downfall. There may be something, too, to the fact that the novelty and the shock of seeing women as athletes started to wear off in the cities that featured the women's racing. And in fact, what happens over the 1898, 1899, 1900, 1901 is that the women's circuit, where they were traveling around the country, racing in different cities, they gradually started to spread out to smaller and smaller cities. So they started in Cleveland and Kansas City and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Minneapolis. And then gradually they started to go to Johnstown, New York, and Calumet, Michigan, and, you know, Racine, Wisconsin. And when they would go to those small cities, it was new. And so they were popular there. But now the crowds were in the hundreds as opposed to in the thousands. The manufacturers, too, stopped sponsoring the races because they were no longer making money hand over fist selling bicycles because everybody had a bicycle.
Yeah.
So now there was a huge used bicycle market as opposed to a new bicycle market. And so the manufacturers pulled their sponsorship. So now the women had to rely on the gate receipts for hundreds of people paying a dime to come in. So instead of $200 first prize, now you're talking $80 first prize. And so these women started to lose interest themselves. And as I said, they started to get a little older. So all those things contributed to the demise of the sport. I think what is amazing about women's bicycle racing in particular is that between 1902, when that era died, and 1958, when there was the first women's championship in America, there was virtually no women's racing on bicycles. There was some local racing. And there was in 1937, there was a girls' championship. But in terms of women's racing in America, there's a 56-year gap. And it wasn't until 1984 when it became an Olympic sport. And it was 1984 when they had a Tour de France for women for the first time. So that's 82 years after Tilly and Dottie and Lizzie Glaw stopped racing.
I'm so glad you put it in that way because that's really what I took away as a cyclist reading your book, or not the only thing, but one of the things is like, we've been doing this stuff a long time, you know, and what we as humans, women and men, have been able to do on a bicycle. Like you say, it's a long time ago, but it's also not that long ago. Not much has changed in the last 120 years, really. So my podcast centers mostly around the endurance side of cycling. Have you ever heard of the Tour Divide?
No.
Okay, so that one is from it's an off-road mountain bike course. You might find this interesting. That goes from Banff, Canada, all the way to Antelope Wells, New Mexico. So basically border to border. It's 2,700 miles, follows the Rockies. And it's one of the most popular endurance races, if not the most popular endurance race in the world right now. And people are doing that in 14, 15 days. And one of the top athletes is Lael Wilcox. You should Google her. And I've had a couple of interviews with her, but she she's like the modern day Dottie or Tilly. You know, she is going out there and beating men, competing with men. I mean, her objective is not to just win the women's category. She wants to win. And endurance cycling or endurance sports, we're learning, I think, and we've probably known it for a while, is an area where men and women become equalized because men can't use their raw, power or whatever to just get a quick lead and have that carry them through. In an endurance setting, it's how tough are you physically and mentally. And so, yeah, just from my perspective as a cyclist, an endurance cyclist, reading your book and drawing those parallels and seeing how just capable they were 120 years ago was fascinating.
And it's also, it's humbling, and it doesn't take anything away from what the women are doing now. But it's important to know that women did that in the 1890s. And 2 or 3 hours a night may not seem like an endurance race to you now, but back then, to race 2 or 3 hours in an evening without stopping and racing at pretty much top speed for those 2 or 3 hours was a feat of endurance. It takes amazing physical conditioning to be able to do that. Especially, I mean, I'm sure many cyclists today, I certainly would struggle to get anywhere close. Yeah, to 22 miles an hour for 3 hours straight is not easy.
And how many miles were they lapping total in a 6-day period? How many total miles would they log?
Yeah, so they would, like I said, they would average about 20 or 22 miles an hour. So they would race 2 hours a night, 12 hours. So it'd be 240, 250 miles. If they did an 18-hour race, which was 3 hours a night, then they'd be up around 360 or 370 miles for the week.
Yeah.
Now there were legitimate endurance races back then when people would go 1,100 miles or 1,200 miles in a week in much larger formats. But these women were completing 250 miles and averaging 22 miles an hour. And
on how heavy were their bikes? I'm going to hold up. If you're not watching, you can't see this, but this is an old Daytona chain ring that I got that would have been hopefully period correct for around 1895 or 1900 or so, something similar to what Dottie would have. And this thing is heavy. It's very heavy. I can't imagine. Do you know what these bikes weighed?
I think they weighed in between 15 and 20 pounds.
No way. For real?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's quite impressive.
Because there was one, Tilly had a bike that was a 40-pound bike when she first started racing, and she remembered it as incredibly heavy bike that she started with, 40 pounds. And they do give some of the technical details of the bicycles on occasion, and that's what I remember, about 15 or 20 pounds for the bike.
Okay.
Now they were very simple bicycles, of course. They were no brakes, no single gear, and
nothing else.
Yeah, nothing there, and the tires were very light. So I don't know. I think that's about what they were.
I just assumed that they were heavier. That's because I was picturing 40 or 50 pound bikes that they were lugging around between 22 to 24 miles an hour over the course. I mean, I don't care. Well, maybe top athletes, but if I got on a track right now and tried to go full out for 3 hours at 24 miles an hour, and I did it for 6 consecutive days, I'd be in the hurt locker by the end of the week. I guarantee it. And I'm competitive. I want to win, so I'm going to be pushing it. So what
another thing that I think people will find interesting is how popular cycling was in, let's say, 1895. Can you put into perspective the popularity surrounding it at that time period?
It was a craze that spread through the whole country. It was a revolution in transportation. It allowed people to go between two towns 10 miles away from each other in an afternoon. You could make it over there in an hour and 10 minutes. And so millions and millions and millions of people bought bicycles in 1893, 1894, and 1895. And it became a huge industry. And virtually, all of the bicycle manufacturers that we remember from the 20th century, from Schwinn to Columbia, were developed or created during that time. Every single town every town of any size had multiple bicycle manufacturers and multiple bicycle shops to service all the bikes that were sold. And it appealed not only to men, which is what the high wheel bicycle appealed to because it was so difficult to ride, but also to women and children. And so when women got on the bicycle, it was a social revolution in that women could now ride from house to house and town to town by themselves or with a friend without a chaperone. And so it was a social challenge to the notion that women always rode in a carriage with the man, riding the horses, steering the horses. So it was revolutionary in that sense, but also it took over the country. You may know that most of the auto manufacturers and plane manufacturers started off as bicycle manufacturers, and most of the technology that was used in cars and in airplanes developed out of the bicycle. So, and the roads too. The very first road movement came as the result of the bicycle. So bicyclists were the ones who said, we need paved roads. We need roads that we can ride on in the spring when everything is muddy. So let's start to build a road system. And the irony of today is that you're saying share the road, but it was the other way around. When cars came in, it was let's try to get on the road that the bicycles created. So, kind of what comes around, But
did y'all hear that, world? We were here first.
That's right.
Sorry, I had to.
In fact, the League of American Wheelmen, which is the governing body of all bicycling back in the 1890s, basically morphed through various incarnations into the Automobile Association of America. And wow. A big part of their effort was to create better roads. And they had a magazine. The title of it was Better Roads. And they were advocates politically for better roads in municipalities.
What's the highest attendance number to a women's race? Do you know? I mean, I know you mentioned 12,000 earlier. Is that the highest?
That was the highest I saw. That was in Chicago in 1897, 12,000. The limit was the arena itself. They could only jam so many people into a place. Boxing would often draw 40 or 45,000 people in the 1890s, but that was outside. All boxing matches were outside, and they would build they would build stands for that, the championship bout. Football games, they were just starting to build big stadiums then. Most college games would get 2,500 people or 3,000 people. There was one women's Thanksgiving race in Missouri. On Thanksgiving Day, the University of Missouri played against the University of Kansas and drew 2,500 people. And that night, the two teams came to the women's bicycle race, and they had 4,000.
Wow.
So they outdrawing the college football game.
Wow.
So it was a lot of people, but they were limited by the number of people they could jam into an arena.
Would people travel back then to go and witness these events? Was it that big of a deal, or would just attract whoever, was in the town or the area?
Yeah, I think it was a local phenomenon. And another kind of fascinating dimension of this is that it was a national sport in that everyone in the country knew about it, but it was a local sport in that the women came to you. The women traveled around and appeared in Cincinnati, and then they went to Columbus, and then they went up to Akron, and then they went to Detroit, and then they went over to Grand Rapids, and then they went down to Chicago. And so they made a circuit. And when they arrived in a town, it was the biggest news of the week. Everybody paid attention. Then when they were in Kansas City, nobody cared anymore. It was not covered on a national level. It wouldn't, back then, baseball, the National League and the American Association and the Western League would be covered in the sports pages of every town. So they knew what was happening in Minneapolis when a baseball game was played. But and sometimes with the men's bicycle racing, they would cover the sports, the races outside of town. But for the women's racing, I saw very little evidence that there was some, but very little coverage of the women's sport that wasn't in town. So it was a local phenomenon. But everybody got the same sport when it traveled around, so everybody got to know it.
That's interesting. So I know, and we haven't talked about this yet, but there was a lot of dramatics playing out in the newspapers. A lot of, before the race, there was a lot of talks about the athletes, and then during the race, so-and-so, Dottie would say, Tilly pushed me, and there was a lot of back and forth that would create just a dramatic effect. And I didn't realize this when I was reading the book. And so each time that happened, it was a new audience, so to speak.
That's right.
Huh.
So they were entertainers, and the managers I think they pushed the women to exaggerate their jealousies and their competition. I think there was a little bit of, we're friends back at the hotel, but when we're on the track, we'll go ahead and play up our enmity between each other. And I think they also felt competitive, and they probably learned to dislike each other just like any other people. But there's no question that there was a pattern to every week's race. So they would arrive in Grand Rapids. On Sunday before the race, they have a public opening at the track to see the women practice. And so everybody could get used to, oh, wow, that track is really something. And look at these women, they're in great outfits. We definitely want to come to this race. And then the reporters would report on that. And then on Monday night, they would start the race, and they would comment on their outfits, and they would talk about what Tilly's record was and what the record was, the fastest time for a 6-day race was. And they would play up the possibility of a record being set here in Grand Rapids. And then they would talk about Dottie's failure to beat Tilly back in Detroit when they were racing last week. Mm-hmm. And they would talk about Tilly being from Sweden, and Ida being from Norway, and Lizzie being from Germany, and Dottie being from America, and talk about the jealousies between them for those reasons. And as the week went on, people started to cheer for different individuals, and they took favorites. And then, of course, as you say, they would start to jostle each other. Somebody would push Dottie down, and Dottie would complain, and then the crowd would boo. And so they would play up those dramatics. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I picture a little bit of like professional wrestling and, professional cyclists. Like and it's like you said, I mean, at first it was, let's watch women ride bikes, it was a novelty. And I get the sense that they knew that, and that, they were there for the money, so they'll play the role, and part of the role was being dramatic and giving the paper something to talk about. And from what I understand, Dottie was one of the better ones. She was a little bit of a showboater, I take it.
She was. I like Dottie a lot. And part of it is because I think I mentioned before, she was not working class. Her family was a fairly well-to-do family from Minneapolis. And she had gone to a boarding school in Minneapolis, or in St. Paul, really, and had training in the theater and in dance. And so she was a relatively refined person. And I think she understood as much as anyone else that it was about appealing to the crowd. And if anything, her record was hurt by the fact that sometimes she would rather play to the crowd. And what I mean by that is sometimes the crowd would urge on a racer to take the lead. And sometimes in the second hour of a 3-hour race, it was not a good idea to be in the lead. It was better to be second or third or in the middle of the pack. And Lizzie, for example, who was always there for the money, refused to take the lead. She would always ride in the draft of the other racers, and she would never take her turn in the front to set the pace or to take the wind or whatever. And Dottie would, so that when the crowd cheered for Dottie to take the lead, she would take the lead, and they would cheer her for that. But in the end, it probably hurt her as a racer, and she came in second more times than anyone else, and it was an amazing thing.
I can't tell you how many times I've read your book, or I've only read the book once, but how many times I was reading your account of a race and Dottie lost, or came in second. Dottie came in second. I was like, okay, I get it.
Right. And you have to be pretty good to be in second all the time. So she was a very good racer.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Of course, I was always rooting for her, but that history is what history is.
I just want to say that she stood up for herself. She would complain to the referees about unfair treatment, and but she also took it every time and came back and raced some more. So I think she was a really good character and a really good person for the sport. And I'm really glad she was one of those competitors.
Well, thank you. I was going to ask you if you have a favorite just story or something that really like stuck out whenever you're researching the book. You're like, oh my gosh, did you have any of those moments?
Yeah, I think my favorite one actually is about Dottie and Tilly. In the summer of 1896, they were racing in Minneapolis, and it was an outdoor race where they built a track inside of a baseball field, and they had built temporary stands around the track, and then they had put a fence around that so they could charge tickets. And it was over the July 4th holiday, and they had a couple of rainouts, which caused the race to be extended. Instead of finishing on Saturday, which was July 4th, they had to extend it to Monday.
Yeah.
And so they had Sunday off because they never raced on Sundays. And when they came back on Monday, Tilly and Dottie were tied for first place, and then there were 2 or 3 other racers that were behind. So it was clear that the race was between Tilly and Dottie. And this was Dottie's hometown. So there was a big crowd in favor of Dottie to win the race. Tilly was already well established as the best racer, though, so it was going to be a tough match for the finish. So on Monday night, when they came together for the race, there were thousands of people there. There were hundreds of people outside the fence that didn't get tickets. And when they were ready to start the race, it was announced that Dottie was sick and was unable to race that day. And so the crowd started booing and was upset. And the manager of the race, they were talking through a megaphone. This is before microphones. So they were talking through a megaphone and saying that they were going to go ahead and complete the race tonight with no Dottie. So Tilly would race against the other 3 people. And all the crowd started to go crazy. It was unfair. It would not be interesting to watch because Tilly was clearly going to win without Dottie there. And so then the manager changed their mind and said, no, we'll postpone the race. We'll come back tomorrow and finish it. But today we'll have the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place people race. And the crowd was unhappy with that too, because they wanted to see Dottie and Tilly race. And by the way, Tilly said, wait a minute, I'm here. Let's race tonight. I want to finish the race. Gradually, the crowd started to get mixed messages. They didn't know what was happening. And in the end, they started basically a riot. And they started to pull the panels off the fence, hit people with them. They stormed the box office. They tore down the building where the box office was. The women started to go around the track, and people started to jump on the track and stop the women. At one point, the crowd knocked out a gentleman who attacked one of the women and carried them out of the arena on their shoulders. The outside fences broke down. The people who were outside came in. This started around 8:30 p.m. and it didn't clear up till midnight. And the next day in the newspaper, they said it was one of the biggest riots in Minneapolis history. All because Tilly or Dottie didn't show up for that race. So it shows not only the popularity of the sport, but how seriously the fans took the the finish of the races.
Yeah. I forgot about that story. I'm glad you recanted it to me because it does show exactly that. I mean, these people were heavily invested and just wanted to watch a good race. That's all they really wanted, right? A good, fair race was all they wanted to see. And of course, women riding their bikes, which was show enough, I guess. Is there any chance that a movie will get made of this?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, anybody who does research like this and writes a book like mine believes that it would be a great movie. No, I don't think my book would be a great movie, but I think
there's a story there.
The settings of the arena with the wooden track and the steeply banked and the men with the megaphones and the people dressed up with their top hats and I mean, they were smoking and drinking and the kids were sometimes throw tacks on the track to try to upset the race. And just there's so much great atmosphere. And then to introduce the women, you have Tilly, you have Dottie, you have Lizzie Glaw. We've some that we haven't even talked about. They each have their own character. My book is, it's a work of nonfiction, and I was basing it on the articles, the contemporary articles that I read. If you had someone with some imagination and they took some liberties, if it was a based on story, I think they could make a terrific story. And if filmmaker were to recreate these tracks and to recreate the atmosphere, and we haven't mentioned too that they would have a small orchestra playing music, marches, pumping the women on through the music to try to get them to race faster. In fact, I think the manager sometimes would say, pick up the music so that the women would pick up the pace, and that was another thing that Dottie would respond to, whereas Lizzie, for example, would not respond. I don't care how fast the music's going, I'm going to race my race, whereas Dottie would pick it up. But I think that would make a great movie. I have talked to some filmmakers and some documentary folks, and I think somebody is working on a documentary of some kind, but in terms of feature length, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, I would love to see one. The way you wrote the book, it is nonfiction, but there's a great narrative told throughout the whole book. You do a good job of setting the stage of what it was like politically, socially at that time. Just the conditions that they were racing in. It's a great story. And I don't think a lot of people know it. I mean, me as a cyclist growing up, I've been a cyclist my entire life. And I just was completely unaware that this ever even happened, Like what did you say there was between women's racing? It was like 52 years or something?
50 years.
Yeah, something like that. So yeah, I just wasn't even aware of this. And I would love personally to see a movie get made, but any other books in the works for you in the same type of vein? Did this maybe like with the men's endurance racing or anything? Was there anything else that you might latch onto and write about, or are you even allowed to talk about that?
I do think that men's racing has been covered much, much better, and there's a lot more about it. Right now, there's a fairly strong resurgence of interest in Major Taylor, who was a contemporary of Tilly's, an African-American racer. And I believe that Tilly should be recognized as the female Major Taylor, breaking the glass ceiling of women's racing, just as he broke the ceiling for African-American athletes. Somebody should probably write a book about the men's racing of the 1890s that really focuses just on that decade. I don't think that's been done. But I think what's interesting to me, and I don't know if I'll do it, but there were two gentlemen who really kickstarted the women's racing of the 1890s. One is a guy named H.O. Messier, who built the tracks and was one of the original promoters of women's racing. Now, a very interesting person who had already been a professional walker, a race walker, a pedestrian, in the 1870s and 80s, and then took to sports management and then kind of latched on to women's racing. And he was the first one really to design a track that was banked all the way around. So that the men's tracks generally were only banked on the ends. And so for the reasons I cited earlier, he banked it all the way around, but he was able to kind of figure out that calculus that if we bank it just this much and we have a track this size, the women are going to be able to fly around this track pretty well. And he also came up with the format for the women's racing. Later, he published the first book of sports statistics in 1902, I think, 1903. And he published that book for about 10 years straight, from 1902 to about 1911 or something. And I've always been interested in sports stats. And I think the 19th century, I think one of the appeals of baseball was that it was a sport that loaned itself to having statistics.
Yeah.
So he was a pioneer in the sense that he helped women's sport. And then he also was interested in statistics. And then his partner in crime, if you will, in creating the sport was a gentleman named Ed Moulton, who they called Dad. He was a trainer. He was one of the very first trainers in university athletics in the 1880s and 1890s, worked at the University of Missouri, the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Minnesota, and later became a trainer at Stanford University. He trained football and baseball and track, and he ended up having a 20 or 30-year career at Stanford. And so in the back of my mind, I have the notion of going out to Stanford University where they have his papers and see if I can find out more about these people. And I think it would be interesting to kind of write a book about these early sports managers or sports promoters and who helped to create the spectacle of popular sports here in America.
Yeah. I thought a lot about that as I was reading the book as to the mechanics of it. There's a lot going on. I mean, when you read the book, this is a big deal and there's a lot going on. And so how it was all orchestrated to me is quite interesting. So as an author, how do you decide when it's time to write a book?
Well, I should say I'm a writing professor at a university, so I'm busy. I'm teaching classes and working, and I loved writing this book. It took a long time. I worked on it for 4 or 5 years, off and on during my, as I completed my day job. In this case, it was such compelling material, and I felt like it really needed to be told. I mean, I think, as you say, as a lifelong cyclist, you had never realized that these women had this career.
Yeah.
And I just really think it's important for people to know about it. In some ways, it's a once in a lifetime thing for someone like me to come across material like that. It's unusual, to find something that needs to be told so strongly. So I don't know if I'll ever get that motivated again. We'll have to see. But it was awfully fun to write, and I'm really happy to have done it. And I love connecting with people like you because in my research, I thought, hey, I'll contact some relatives of these women racers, and they'll be able to give me a lot of information about their relative because surely they know about them. And time again, I found myself informing people that they had a famous great aunt or great-grandmother who raced in the 1890s. And I ended up sending Alice's pictures to them and sending them drafts of my chapter, which would feature that racer. And so it's just really cool for people to realize that they did have a connection to famous people. And my hope is that Dottie, Lizzie, Tilly, Lizette, and a couple of the other racers who are very good become known figures, and that people like the women that you mentioned are aware of their progenitors, the people that laid the foundation for what they're doing today.
Yeah.
And that's really the fondest hope for this book, is that people that they enter into the vocabulary of people who are interested in the sport.
That is very well said. And that is exactly why I wanted you to come on the podcast, because I think that it's important. I think it's important for us to understand where we come from and the history that we're built on, and to show it the respect that it deserves, maybe. Genuinely, I loved your book, not just because Dottie was in it. I at first was only interested, Dottie's in there. Let me read. I'm related to her. What can I find out? But as I read the book, it was so much more than Dottie. I mean, it really opened up my eyes. And so I'm hoping that people that listen to this will go out and seek it out and realize a rich history of cycling in America that's been here for a long time. And God damn it, the roads are ours.
That's right. Well, I agree with Patrick. It's the case.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All right, friends, thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you to Roger Gilles for coming on the show. It's a fantastic book. I appreciate you sharing some of the stories here. And I hope that my listeners will go out there and pick up a copy and read it. It's an amazing period in our history, especially as cyclists. There's so much that we can glean from it and pay a little bit of respect to the people who came before us and laid down the groundwork for what we have today. If you enjoyed this episode, like always, it would mean a lot if you could go over to bikesfordeath.com and find a way to contribute to the growth of this show. As we go into 2020, I got big plans and I can't do it without you. Thank you for being here. I hope you'll walk away feeling inspired by the stories of Tilly, Dottie, Lizzie, and the others. The next time that you go, ride your damn bike.
You load up your bike, you ride away from home. You could be with your friends or you could be alone. You ride for a day or maybe more. You just love being in the great outdoors. Everything you need is strapped to your bars, including that new pillow you got from Santa Claus. And then you think, oh shit, to yourself. You left that super lightweight tent on the living room shelf. Bikes.